feeling incredibly inadequate after Manish's fantastic presentation, and equally about the fact that I have only got a rubbish watch and Lisa to tell me what time it is instead of a nice robot. So I'm feeling, I know, and I've got a clock, yes, but it's all a bit old technology, Lisa, I'm afraid.
It still works.
With a little robot.
It still works.
Anyway, Shibley asked me to talk about living alone at home. Now I want to start off first of all by saying that Shibley, we all had hope that Wendy Mitchell would be here today, and obviously Wendy lives on her own, and she talks about this a lot in her blog about some of the aspects of living alone with dementia. And it's really important to highlight that, you know, me talking about this, I can't substitute for Wendy. It would be much better if Wendy could have been here today to talk with me, but unfortunately she wasn't able to be there. But that's just in case any of you are thinking, actually it'd be much better if we heard from somebody with dementia about living alone at home. I also want to say there's actually comparatively little research about this topic. So what we're going to do really in this session is actually we've got a huge amount of dementia wisdom in the room, so I'm going to focus it very much on not talking a lot, but leaving more time opening for discussion. But some of the themes I'm going to say obviously lead on very strongly from the things that Manish was saying. Now, we know what the research suggests about living alone at home with dementia. It's predominantly women, mostly people who are widowed, and they can be divided up into people who are living with, who do have a family carer, often somebody who's caring at a distance. And one of the things that's particularly true of the United Kingdom is that children are much more likely to live at further geographical distances from their children than in the past. So if you read some of those sort of 1950s works, you know, like Peter Townsend on the London Poor, or Wilmot on Young talking about Woodford, people's children live much nearer them than is the case in the past. So we're not talking about people who can pop in down the road. Often people have got very long journeys before they actually can reach the person for whom they're supporting. And then of course there are those without a family carer. These could be people who perhaps have suffered multiple bereavements in their lives, those who don't have other family members. It's like when you said that, Lisa, when you spoke about only having one arm. Yes. You know, families come and households come in so many different shapes and sizes. We can't make assumptions about people, you know, generalise about people. We have to accept that there's a huge range of living conditions. Actually, there's very little research. So one of the most important studies was carried out a few years ago by, well, including Bob Woods and Martin Orrell. But actually, this was one of the few recent studies that actually included looking at people with dementia and carers with a group of people who lived alone and hearing about what their carers said. But there's some stuff that's been done in the past, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in a moment. I was very privileged to be able to work with Enid Levin, who was one of the first researchers who looked at support for those who were living with dementia. And one of the things she found with her research that reported in 1989 was that people with dementia who lived alone were much more likely to move into a care home than those who lived in the same household as the same person who they cared for. Now, unfortunately, nobody's replicated that research recently. But if we're talking about people in the UK who are reliant upon public funds to pay for their care, actually they're very unlikely to be moving into a care home. I mean, Shibley showed that in Shibley's presentation, he showed us the figures from the King's Fund, which show that although the proportion of older people within the population has expanded tremendously over recent years, actually the number of places in care homes has declined. So actually we're much more likely to be talking about people living on their own rather than being moved into a care home quicker than in the past. And we've ended up with a sort of but perhaps we may have gone to another extreme. One of the things I remember really very vividly from going to see a woman many, many years ago, I was going to talk to her about, she's taking part in a research project I was doing about support for people with dementia. She lived in an inner London borough. She lived in she had a little flat in a rented house. The quality of the house was not great. There were lots of uncomfortable stairs. She had a garden with a view. She had no means of getting out into the garden. Around her house there were lots of uncomfortable stairs, there was no sophistication, there was no wet room. She was virtually a prisoner in her own home, and she did have visits from home care about 4 times a day. And we started talking about her life. And I suddenly realised that, do you know what? Her problem was not dementia, her problem was loneliness. And what's the thing that I think we really need to think about? And I want to really say, really, when we talk about living alone with dementia, it's actually about all of us. It's not about the dementia. We mustn't focus too much upon the dementia. The other thing which I think Manish made this point really well too, is that often when we look at what it's like to live alone with dementia, often there are contrasts between the views of family carers and services and those of people with dementia. So family carers and services concentrate so much on the physical risks, and they talk about aspects of physical safety. Will somebody scald themselves making a cup of tea? What can we do about that? Oh, what will happen if somebody comes along knocking at the door and they're vulnerable to financial abuse? Of course, both of these are true. But if you ask people with dementia what are their real concerns, they talk about their quality of life. They talk about things like loneliness. They talk about the lack of opportunities to do things that they enjoy. And I think we really have to sort of, as Manish said, we really need to make this, sort of have this discussion about what people with dementia want, as well as what carers and what services want. And I think the really important point is to think about the future as well as what's happening now. We know that actually there are much higher numbers of people with dementia, of people living alone, than in the past. So at the moment, we're talking about almost 2.5 million people, aged 45 to 64, who live alone in the UK. And the proportion of those living alone in the population is rising. And interestingly enough, I said at the beginning, at the moment when we look at the population of people with dementia who live alone, it's mainly women, it's mainly widows. Actually, this group mainly consists of men, often men who are divorced or who have not been married, and actually they make up the majority of the group. But where is this discussion taking place in current dementia policy about what's going to happen in the future? And I think we obviously need to think more about housing and support solutions. One of the difficulties when we talk about dementia is sort of we get into this dementia silo, don't we? We only think about it in terms of the effects of dementia, the effects of cognitive impairment. Actually, we need to think about the wider context. We need to think about, obviously, as Manish has really shown very well, the role of assistive technology. One of the things that's very striking is that it's much more developed in Scandinavia than in the UK. And if we look at, again, if we're looking at people who can't afford to pay for their own assistive technology, people are very much reliant upon if their council has got a contract with which provider their council has got a contract with. Some colleagues of mine are doing some research into this at the moment, and they found that often, you can look at the plethora of assistive technology devices that are available, but often a very limited amount of those are available to people with dementia. And shockingly, some of those things about in terms of having somebody who can be first response if the alarm goes off, often people who don't have a carer are not being given access to these services because there's no system set in place to have somebody who can call on somebody if the alarm's gone off. It needs to be a family carer, or I suppose in the case of somebody who doesn't have a family carer, somebody with enough income to pay somebody to take on that role. So I think that's a really, we need to, Manish made a point in terms of access to smartphones, but we need to think about inequities in terms of all those other aspects of dementia. We also need to think a little bit about housing. One of the things that was perhaps one of the good things one of the developments that took place in the last Labour government was when they set up this idea that all new homes should be built to lifetime home standard. That's very much the focus upon the physical environment, though. It's not necessarily maybe the right may not always help people with dementia. A couple of years ago, we were very lucky at the Social Care Workforce Research Unit where I work, at our annual conference. We had a presentation from the first group who had set up the first co-housing solution in London. And this was a co-op where people were living in a group of purpose-built flats. They tended to be people over 40 rather than younger people. And it was about finding sort of solutions that would enable people to support each other, not just the idea of necessarily moving into extra care housing, but ways of sort of, you know, being more perhaps being more neighbourly, really. It's actually not about, you know, a housing solution, it's about finding ways in which we can be neighbourly. And I think the other thing we need to think about really strongly is about balancing needs and choices. I know that many of you will also follow Tommy Dunn, who lives with dementia. He did a very powerful tweet a couple of days ago where he said, before you get dementia, your biggest fear is getting dementia. Once you've got dementia, your biggest fear is going into a care home. We really, I mean, and yet we know that those of us who have been into care homes know that there are some incredibly good care homes. And obviously the next presentation, I've noticed that you've segued this along very nicely, Shipley. The next presentation is about care homes. We need to help people plan for the future way before they get dementia, so that they can think about, if they are going to be living alone with dementia, what's the best way to do it. So thank you very much for listening. Time just to have a discussion for any points, because there's obviously, as I say, there's so much wisdom in this room that it seems a waste not to use it.
Jo, you're in charge. You can chat to the audience.
Okay.
So 5 minutes to do that.
You'll give us a
yes, I will.
I don't know if anybody's got any points that they want to say in relation to the things I've been saying, or anything that I haven't mentioned.
There's somebody at the back there. I think it's Shirley.
Yeah.
Jo, one question, as you'll be aware, I have challenged the whole issue of institutional care for people as they get older, because I don't believe it's fit for purpose in the 21st century. And I have my own vision about what I want. And one of the things I found in talking to people, nobody wants to plan for a later life that is institutional care. And so we've got, on the one hand, we've got to have enough homes to accommodate everybody. My generation is saying, we don't want that at all. The cost, the value isn't worth it. And so there's this real disconnect between policy planners and people like me and many people I talk to about what we want for our future, and it's not reflected in what's happening at the moment.
And not just policy planners, but also those people who are building retirement villages throughout the place. I mean, it's not necessary, that isn't an option that everybody wants either. So, you know, many people would look on living in a retirement village as really quite, you know, in quite a negative way. But those discussions, one of the things is quite difficult to ask people about the future, isn't it? Many people don't like to think about it. And many people don't like to think, you know, sometimes it's about having difficult discussions. But perhaps you're right that, you know, you're right that many people who, well, I'm actually even among people who are in their 80s, I don't know many people who say I'd like to live in a care home, actually. I think that there comes a point that when you want to live in a care home is when things have become too much of a struggle. And actually, it can be a relief moving into a care home. Because you're just sick of struggling to do things like drag the bin out to the front, you know, go to the shops. A lot of these things that may make life more difficult. People who, you know, I think we must respect that there are some people for whom care homes are the solution, but we're not providing new options are not coming through as quickly. People are still, you know, if I were a sort of a hedge fund manager, I might be doing a presentation about great to invest in care homes and nothing about investing in alternatives. You know, this example of the housing co-op, that's been set up by a not-for-profit organisation. It's not been set up by a profit-making organisation.
Thanks, great presentation. Actually, they've all been good, but this is the first chance to engage in the conversation. And part of the challenge we've got here is that people are still forced into making decisions about residential care at critical times. We don't have systems and structures and processes, and I guess within that, staff capability I'm sure is there, but the staff time just to help people think through what the options look like. And so I think if you're on your own, it's perhaps not that surprising that actually you're much more likely to end up in a residential care setting, because who else is going to look after your I mean, your families, you had an aunt, you're much more likely to have been her best advocate, her only advocate, but actually her best advocate. And I fear that with this increasing number of older adults who are living on their own, there's nobody to advocate for them. There is a crisis that's going to happen at some point, and of course people are then forced into making the wrong decisions, potentially, because there's a crisis. And we see that writ large with people in beds at the moment where it's really difficult because what are the options for the move on requirements? So people increasingly being forced into those wrong decisions.
Absolutely, and we know that, you know, often if there are very good homes that have waiting lists and you're in hospital and people are actually putting pressure upon you to actually find a solution, it may not be possible for you to wait until the home that you want to go into. I mean, you're right, it is a really difficult position. I mean, sometimes, of course, people's families don't necessarily, they can be their advocates, but they may not always be their advocates.
Yeah.
I remember doing a session on risk with a group of practitioners, and we were talking about different examples. And one of the examples that came up was an example of a man who he lived in a bungalow that he owned that, and he had a fall. He went into hospital. The family spent so long quarrelling over what adaptations needed to happen and what ought to be done and who was going to pay for it. He had a fall in hospital and ended up going into a care home.
Yeah.
And he stayed there for months. So equally, I think one of the very unspoken discussions is about inheritance and money and who owns things.
Yeah.
And, you know, not everybody thinks that a person with dementia's assets are their assets. I mean, this is slightly off topic, but I have a friend who looks after, who supports her mum who has dementia. And her mum had a manicure. Her two brothers have questioned how much money is being spent. And they said, you shouldn't be spending money on a manicure now her mother likes having her nails done. And I was thinking, if her mother didn't have dementia, can anybody imagine somebody writing in saying you can't spend your money on a manicure if actually you've got quite enough money to pay for it? I mean, this is a real example of where people with dementia are discriminated against and not allowed to make the choices that they want to make.
I think we'll say thank you so much because we can all converse at